It arrived on black paper with a silver seal, no sender's name. 5 words that read like a joke. 3 days until her funeral. Duchess Rosalind Hartwell laughed until she walked into her mother's parlor and found the staircase already wrapped in mourning ribbon, 2 maids arguing over which coffin would fit through the door. Hers. Everyone in that house already knew. Only she had been left in the dark, and by the time she understood why, her own husband had already decided exactly how she was going to die. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The invitation arrived on black paper, sealed in silver wax, with no sender's name. Duchess Rosalind Hartwell broke the seal at her breakfast table, expecting an announcement, a wedding, perhaps a royal summons. What she found instead was 5 words that made no sense at all. 3 days until her funeral. Beneath it, her own name, her own title, a chapel, a date. And below that, a list of guests who had already confirmed they would attend. She read it twice, certain it was a mistake, some cruel prank meant for another household entirely. She almost laughed. Instead, she folded the invitation into her sleeve and decided there was only one sensible thing to do. Ride to her mother's house and show her. Certain they would find it absurd together, the way they found most things absurd together, over tea, with her mother's sharp tongue turning even nonsense into comedy. She did not find comedy waiting for her at Hartwell Manor. She found lilies, white, fresh, overwhelming, covering the entrance hall from door to staircase. She found black mourning ribbon being measured along the banister by 2 maids who did not hear her come in. "Will the coffin fit through the west entrance?" one of them asked. Her mother requested the larger carriage, the other replied, not looking up from her work. Rosalind stood frozen in the doorway. They were not discussing some distant relation, some elderly aunt whose time had come. They were discussing measurements, fittings, logistics, for her. She followed their voices deeper into the house until she reached her mother's private sitting room. The door stood open a hand's width. Inside, Lady Constance Hartwell sat with the family solicitor, Mr. Alden Cross, and 2 stewards, all of them bent over a guest list as though planning nothing more urgent than a dinner party. "The invitations have all been delivered," Cross said. "Excellent," her mother replied. 3 days gives everyone enough time to arrive." "And the Duke's family?" "They're fully prepared." Rosalind's hand closed around the doorframe. Her mother already knew. The solicitor already knew. The stewards, the maids, every soul in that house had already been told something she had learned only by accident, over breakfast, on a piece of paper meant for someone else's eyes. She stepped into the room. The conversation stopped as if a door had slammed somewhere far off. Her mother's face rearranged itself into a smile, a half-second too late, a half-second too bright. "Darling," she said, "you're early." Rosalind held up the invitation. "Who sent this?" Her mother took it from her hand before she could stop her, glancing at it as though seeing it for the first time. Some tasteless joke. Someone with a cruel sense of humor, clearly. "Then why," Rosalind asked, "is the staircase already dressed in mourning ribbon?" No one in that room answered her. Cross busied himself with his papers. The stewards found sudden interest in the floor. Her mother simply repeated the word joke, softer this time, as though saying it quietly might make it more convincing. Rosalind had already seen the guest list on the desk behind them. She had already heard the words coffin and carriage spoken like matters of furniture. They were lying to her, in her own family's home, to her own face. And still, some stubborn, loyal part of her refused to believe the conspiracy could possibly reach any further than her mother's poor judgment. Her husband, surely, would be horrified. Her husband would tear that invitation apart and demand to know who dared frighten his wife. She left Hartwell Manor within the hour, riding for Kessington Hall, certain that once Alaric saw what she had found, everything would be made right. She had no way of knowing she was riding directly toward the people who had written her death sentence. Kessington Hall was quiet when Rosalind arrived. Quieter than she expected for a house that should have been alarmed by what she carried in her hand. She went straight for her husband's study, invitation clutched tight, already rehearsing how she would tell him, already imagining the fury that would cross his face on her behalf. The door was open a hand's width. He was not alone. She heard voices before she saw anything, and something in the tone of them stopped her before she could announce herself. She stood still in the corridor instead, and looked through the gap in the door. Inside stood Duke Alaric Sterling, her husband of 6 years. Beside him, his younger brother, Lord Julian Sterling, pale and silent near the window. In the armchair closest to the fire sat the Dowager Duchess Wilhelmina Sterling, her rings catching the firelight as she folded her hands in her lap. And bent over the desk, tracing a finger along a document laid flat before him, stood her own brother, Lord Bennet Hartwell. Maps covered the desk, legal papers, a seating chart, and at the top of it, written in her husband's own hand, one word, chapel. Alaric spoke first, his voice low, measured, the voice he used when he believed himself to be entirely reasonable. "If anything happens before Saturday," he said, "the Crown Charter transfers immediately." Bennet nodded, as though confirming an appointment. "The accident has already been arranged." Rosalind's hand tightened around the doorframe. The word accident moved through her like cold water, finding every vein in her body at once. Then the Dowager spoke, and it was her voice, calm and unhurried, that Rosalind would remember longest. "And if she survives?" There was no pause before the answer. No hesitation, no flicker of doubt. Nothing to suggest the question had cost him anything at all to hear. "She won't," Alaric said. The invitation slipped from Rosalind's fingers and fell without a sound onto the corridor floor. The man she had married, her own brother, her own mother, waiting at home surrounded by lilies she had ordered herself. Two families who had spent a decade competing for standing at every ball, every dinner, every christening, united now in exactly one purpose: burying her. She did not remember stepping back from that door, or climbing the stairs, or reaching her own bedchamber. She only remembered standing there afterward, staring down at her hands as though they belonged to a stranger, someone who was already gone, and simply hadn't yet been informed of it. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake turning over every version of what she had heard, searching for some misunderstanding, some other meaning to the words accident and survive. And she won't. She found none. The sentence had only one shape, and it had already been spoken aloud, calmly, by people who shared her name and her blood. By morning, she had made a decision no one in that house would have expected of her. She would not scream. She would not accuse. She would give away nothing. She kept the appointment already arranged on her calendar, a visit to a charitable hospital several miles from the estate. Because if these were to be among her last hours, she intended to spend at least one of them doing something true. The carriage set out under a pale morning sky. It returned by way of Ravensmere Bridge, the same crossing she had taken 100 times without a second thought. She heard the sound before she understood it. A crack like the world's own bones giving way. The bridge collapsed beneath the horses. The carriage tipped. Black water rose to meet her before she could draw a full breath. By the following morning, the kingdom had already declared the Duchess dead. Her body, they said, had never been recovered. She woke to the smell of smoke and drying herbs. wrapped in a quilt that was not her own, in a cottage she did not recognize. An elderly woman sat by the hearth, stirring a pot with the unhurried patience of someone who had watched that river take things before and give back only a few of them. She did not turn around when she spoke. "You're the Duchess," the woman said. "The one they buried yesterday in the papers." Rosalind's throat was raw from the water she had swallowed. "I'm not dead." "No," the woman agreed, turning now, her eyes far sharper than the lines on her face suggested. "Though it seems a great many people would prefer you were. My name is Agatha Fenn. I've lived beside that bridge for 40 years. It has never once collapsed on its own." For 3 days, Rosalind lay in that cottage while her body healed slower than her understanding did. Agatha brought her broth, bread, and eventually newspapers. Because Rosalind had asked for them, and because Agatha seemed to understand that some wounds could only be tended by facing them directly. The headline on the 4th day read, "Duchess's funeral proceeds as planned, despite tragedy. Proceeds as planned." Rosalind read the words 3 times before their full weight settled into her. A funeral did not simply proceed as planned when the woman at its center had drowned by accident. It proceeded as planned when the plan had existed long before the accident ever did. And then, all at once, she understood the invitation. It had never been meant for her. It had been sent between the conspirators themselves, a confirmation, nothing more. Proof passed from one guilty hand to another that every arrangement had been completed on schedule. A checklist. Somewhere in the delivery, one careless servant, hurrying between houses, had placed it into the wrong hands entirely. That single mistake was the only warning she would ever receive. It had saved her life without either the sender or the intended recipient ever knowing it. She could take that warning and disappear. Build a smaller, quieter life somewhere no one would think to look for a dead woman. Agatha, watching her think it through, seemed to expect exactly that. Instead, Rosalind said something that made the old woman go very still. "I'm going to my own funeral." "Girl," Agatha said slowly, "that is the worst idea I have heard in 40 years beside that river. I'm not going as myself." Rosalind's voice did not shake. "I'm going as no one at all." She would need a plain dress, a linen cap, the posture of a woman no one had ever once thought to look at twice. She had spent 6 years being watched by every room she entered. She understood, better than anyone, exactly what it took to become invisible instead. That evening, before she had finished explaining the shape of her plan, a knock came at Agatha's door. Sharp, official, entirely unfamiliar. Agatha answered it with a poker still in her hand and found a man in the deep blue coat of the King's Guard standing in the frame, hat held against his chest. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I'm Captain Gideon Rourke. I've been sent to investigate the collapse at Ravensmere Bridge." His eyes moved past Agatha, into the room, and found Rosalind standing near the fire, a bandage still wound around her wrist. He did not ask who she was. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already begun to suspect, and is only now confirming with his own eyes. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. Captain Gideon Rourke did not look at her the way everyone else in her life had ever looked at her. Not as a duchess, not as a title or a signature or a name on a guest list. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he intends to actually solve. He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her how relieved he was to find her alive or how fortunate she was to have survived. Instead, he set a small bundle on Agatha's table, unwrapped it, and laid out 3 pieces of splintered wood, each one cut at an angle no natural break could have produced. "I pulled these from the riverbed this morning," he said. Bridge timbers don't fail like this on their own. These were sawed through 3/4 of the way and packed with mud to hide the cut. He looked up at her. That bridge was murdered a full week before you ever crossed it. Rosalind's hands went still around her cup. You believe me? I haven't decided whether to believe you yet, he said, with the plain, unhurried honesty of a man who did not waste words on kindness he wasn't certain was owed. I believe the wood. You, I'm still deciding about. It should have offended her. Instead, something in her chest loosened, small and unfamiliar. The relief of being looked at plainly, without performance, without a single lie, dressed up as concern. Then let me help you decide, she said, and told him everything. She told him of her father, the Crown's covenant keeper, entrusted for decades with the royal covenant. The ancient charter determining who held lawful authority over the succession whenever the throne stood without an heir. She told him that when her father died, the guardianship had passed to her and to her alone, and that as long as she lived, no ambitious family could seize influence over that succession through her signature. Under the old marriage statute, she said, if I die, the guardianship transfers to my husband. Not my wealth, not my jewels. My signature, Captain. That was worth more to them than I've ever been. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, turning the pieces of broken timber over in his hands as though they might yield one more answer. Then you understand, he said finally, that walking into that funeral is either the bravest decision I have ever heard of, or the last mistake you will ever make. Perhaps it's both. Something close to a smile crossed his face, though it did not quite arrive. I've never met a duchess who spoke like that. I've never met a captain who let me finish a sentence. Agatha, from her seat by the hearth, muttered that the two of them were fools, though there was no real complaint in it, and neither of them corrected her. Over the hours that followed, Gideon laid out what the Crown's own investigators had quietly gathered and just as quietly buried. Records of payment to Dr. Osric Bell, the palace physician, for services no one had dared name outright. Falsified maintenance logs for Ravensmere Bridge, signed off weeks before the collapse. Nothing yet that proved intent beyond doubt, enough together to suggest it. There's one piece I don't have, Gideon admitted. Your father's old banking house kept its own records for 30 years. If he entrusted proof of the covenant's true terms to anyone besides you, it would be the director there. Will he speak to a dead woman? Gideon held her gaze longer than the question required. I don't think anyone who spent 5 minutes in a room with you would call you dead. She felt her face warm and disliked how much she didn't mind it. A fist struck Agatha's door then, hard and urgent, 3 knocks in quick succession. Gideon was on his feet before the second one landed, hand already at his sword. It was not the Duke's men at the door. It was Cadmus Reeve himself, breathless, his coat still damp from riding through the night, a leather satchel clutched to his chest as though he expected it to be torn from his hands at any moment. Forgive the hour, he said, once Gideon had lowered his sword and led him inside. I've been trying to reach someone who would listen for 6 years. I did not dare hope it would be her. He looked at Rosalind the way a man looks at a ghost he has spent years praying would return. Your father came to me the month before he died, Reeve said, setting the satchel on Agatha's table with hands that would not quite steady. He told me that if anything happened to him that wasn't natural, I was to keep this until you came asking for it. He said you would. Eventually. He said you were the only one in either family with the spine to actually ask. Inside the satchel, in her father's own hand, were letters written to no one and to everyone. Pages documenting years of quiet pressure from both the Sterling and Hartwell families to relinquish the Covenant guardianship for the stability of the realm. Documenting threats made in rooms with no witnesses. Documenting, in his final letter, a fear that he would not live to see his daughter grown, and a plea to Reeve to protect her when he no longer could. Rosalind read her father's handwriting and felt something break open in her chest that had been sealed shut since the day they buried him. Grief first, then rage sharper and colder at the years he had carried this fear alone rather than hand it to her. He knew, she said quietly. He knew this might happen to me one day, and no one ever thought to tell me. Would you have believed it? Agatha asked from the doorway, her voice gentler than Rosalind had yet heard it. 6 years ago. Would you have believed your own mother capable of this? Rosalind said nothing. The silence answered for her. Gideon, who had been standing near the window watching the road out of habit more than fear, turned back toward the table. This is enough to bring before the king's solicitor. Sir Reginald Thorne is one of the few men left in that court who cannot be bought or frightened into looking away. And if he cannot act before Saturday? Rosalind asked. Then, Gideon said quietly, you walk into that chapel anyway, and you become your own witness. A silence followed that neither of them rushed to fill. Rosalind looked at him. Really looked. The way he had looked at her from the very first night. Without performance, without title, without anything to gain by pretending otherwise. You could hand this to Sir Reginald and let the crown carry it from here, she said. You've already done more than your post required. I could, Gideon agreed. He did not look away from her. I find I don't want to. It was not a declaration. It was not even quite a confession. But it settled between them like warmth from a fire neither of them had deliberately lit. And for one unguarded moment, Rosalind allowed herself to feel something that was not grief. Then Reeve, still catching his breath by the door, added the one detail that turned that warmth to ice. There is something else, he said. I heard it on the road tonight, from a rider coming from the estate. The Duke has moved the funeral. It is no longer Saturday. Rosalind felt the floor of the room shift beneath her, though nothing in it had actually moved. It's tomorrow, Reeve said. They think they've won already. Tell me, if you had one day left to prove the whole world wrong, would you spend it hiding or walking straight through the front door? St. Halstead's Royal Chapel was full by the time Rosalind arrived, hidden beneath a plain gray dress and a linen cap. A serving tray balanced against her hip as though she had carried 100 just like it. No one looks twice at a servant. She had learned that lesson well enough in 6 years of being looked at constantly, and she used it now the way she had never once been permitted to use anything about herself before. She moved among mourners who had bowed to her a year earlier, who now discussed her death in the same breath as the wine selection. She heard her own mother telling a countess how peaceful it was, in the end, that Rosalind had finally found rest. She watched the Dowager Duchess quietly instruct a maid to fetch the Duchess's sapphires from the vault, murmuring that her own daughter would want them before the burial concluded. Every lie was smaller and colder than she had imagined it would be. That was the worst part, how ordinary her murder had become to them. A line item, a convenience, tidied away before the week's end. Near the front pew, Mr. Alden Cross held a document bearing her forged signature, preparing to read her final wishes aloud to a chapel full of people who would never think to question a dead woman's handwriting. She found Julian, the Duke's younger brother, standing apart from the rest near a side pillar. His face pale, his hands clasped so tightly, the knuckles had drained white. He did not look like a man celebrating anything at all. You knew. she said quietly, appearing at his side before he could stop her. Her voice pitched too low for anyone else to catch. Julian's head snapped toward her, and for one terrible second she believed he might scream outright. Instead, his face crumpled, not with cruelty, but with something closer to relief, so violent it looked like pain. "I told him it was wrong," he whispered. "I told him for a year. He said it was already decided before I ever had a say in it. God forgive me, Rosalind. I should have warned you the moment I first heard it spoken aloud." "Then help me now," she said. "It isn't too late for the truth. It's only too late for silence." Outside, through the tall chapel windows, she saw movement on the road, carriages, more than one, moving faster than any funeral procession ever had. The priest was already closing the service. Cross rose from his seat, unfolding the forged final wishes in his hands, clearing his throat to begin reading them aloud to a chapel that believed every word. The doors at the rear of the chapel opened. No one turned to look yet. No one but Rosalind, who understood exactly what those carriages meant and exactly how little time remained. She set the serving tray down on the stone floor without a sound. She reached up and removed the linen cap. She lifted her head, and Duchess Rosalind Hartwell, whom every soul in that chapel had gathered to bury, stood revealed among them, alive, in the center aisle of her own funeral. For a long moment, no one in St. Halstead's chapel moved. Then Lady Constance Hartwell dropped the prayer book she had been clutching, and the sound of its striking stone seemed to break whatever spell had held the room silent. The Dowager Duchess rose at once, already turning toward the side door, and found it blocked by two of the king's guards, their expressions carved from patience and steel. "Sit down, Your Grace," said Sir Reginald Thorne, stepping through the chapel doors with the calm of a man who had already read every document he needed to. "Or be removed." Rosalind walked down the center aisle in her plain gray dress, past the lilies, past the coffin that had never once needed to hold her, and stopped directly in front of her husband. Alaric's face had gone the color of old candle wax. "Rosalind, you're alive," she said. "Yes, I understand it's inconvenient." She lifted the black invitation, the one that had begun all of it, the wax seal now smudged from days spent in her fist. "This," she said, loud enough for the whole chapel to hear, "was never my death notice. It was your confirmation, a checklist passed between the people who planned to bury me. It reached me by mistake, one careless servant's error. And that mistake is the only reason I am standing here instead of lying in that coffin." She turned, taking in the room slowly. Her mother, ashen. Her brother Bennett, refusing to meet her eyes. The Dowager, still calculating, even now. The carriage builder confessed last night, Sir Reginald said, that the bridge timbers were weakened 3 weeks before the collapse, on payment from this household. He nodded to a magistrate, who produced a second document. Dr. Bell has confirmed he was retained to administer a slow poison in the event the bridge failed to finish its work in time. A woman near the back of the chapel fainted into her husband's arms. The invitations, Sir Reginald continued, were dispatched before the accident had even occurred. Mr. Cross's own ledgers confirm the forged final wishes he was moments from reading aloud to this chapel. Cross set the document down as though it had caught fire in his hands. Alaric found his voice at last, low and desperate. "Rosalind, whatever you believe you heard, I heard you say she won't survive," Rosalind said, and her voice did not shake. Though her chest ached with 6 years of a marriage she now understood had never once been real. "Your mother asked. You answered without hesitation. I have spent days trying to imagine a version of that moment that isn't exactly what it sounded like. I cannot find one." He said nothing. There was, finally, nothing left to say. The chief archivist stepped forward and unsealed the original royal covenant before the assembled nobility, confirming aloud what her father had died protecting: that the guardianship belonged to Rosalind alone, unconditionally, and could not be transferred by any statute so long as she lived and refused to relinquish it. "I do refuse it," she said clearly. "I refuse to hand my father's charge to a family that tried to murder me for it." The guards moved toward Alaric, toward the Dowager, toward Bennett, toward her own mother, whose composure had finally broken into something that resembled grief for what she had actually done, rather than fear of being caught doing it. Julian did not resist when a guard approached him, but Sir Reginald raised a hand, glancing toward Rosalind. "He warned no one," Sir Reginald said, "but neither did he act against you. That will be weighed by the crown." Rosalind looked at Julian's stricken face and thought of her father's letter, of the cost of silence, of how many different kinds of guilt there were in the world, and how tired she had grown of sorting them all into neat categories. "Let the crown decide his fate," she said quietly. "I am done deciding who deserves to live." The chapel emptied slowly, guards leading away the people who had gathered to bury her. The coffin left standing open in the center of the aisle, no longer a monument to her death, but to the truth that had outrun it. It was Gideon who found her afterward, in the chapel's side garden, where the same lilies meant for her funeral now simply looked like flowers again. "You didn't have to walk down that aisle alone," he said. "I'd have gone first." "I know." She looked at him, the way he had looked at her from the very first night. Without performance, without title, without anything to gain. But I needed them to see that I could. He did not reach for her. He only stood beside her in the quiet, the way he had stood beside her through every ledger and every letter and every impossible choice of the last several days. Asking for nothing, offering everything. "What happens now?" he asked. "To a duchess who isn't dead, and isn't quite anyone's wife anymore either?" Rosalind considered it. The marriage the crown would dissolve, given the circumstances. The guardianship that was finally, unquestionably hers. The strange, unclaimed shape of a life she had never expected to build twice. "I think," she said slowly, "she's going to need someone honest to help her figure that out. Someone who didn't decide whether to believe her until the evidence earned it." Something eased in Gideon's face, the first unguarded smile she had seen from him. "I happen to know a captain," he said, "with nothing better to do." The coffin behind them remained empty, not because Rosalind had escaped death, but because the truth, for once, had arrived before the ending anyone else had written for him.